Yeah, thank you very much, Rabia and Jacob, for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be at this important conference, and thanks for already introducing this book. Stadt, Land, Boden, it's German. It wanted to bring together initiatives working on the land question, on the rural land question and the urban land question. And I might just add that it's accessible open access via transcript. So I will start. Sagst du auch, Stars, sind's doch die gleichen Sterne und Moon, der Mond, den du als Kind gekannt? Und Gott hält seinen Himmel ausgespannt, als folgte er uns nach in fernster Ferne. Des Nachts im Traum nur droht die Mordkaserne. Und du ruhst aus vom lieben Heimatland. This is the last stanza of Masha Kalekos poem Auf einer Bank im Central Park. On a bench in New York Central Park, the refugee from Berlin looks to the moon and the stars which connect her to her genocidal homeland. The expelled and the persecutors, the rich and the poor alike gaze at the moon, included in their songs and prayers. The moon connects people and places on earth across all times. The moon is a common of humanity. In what follows, I will talk mainly about the moon and outer space. I wish to explore what it means or may mean to understand the moon as a common, to make it into a common through socialization. I will also make reference to the deep seabed and to land on Earth, but my hope is that the ongoing and intensifying struggles over the commercialization and appropriation of the moon, over its conceptualization as a common, may inform how we look at struggles about land on Earth and how we might effectively join struggles and movements against genocide, ascetization, exploitation, and expulsion, and for decolonization, protection of the common, and support for the commons. Not only songs and poems describe the moon, the stars, and the sky as a common of humanity, but also international law denotes moon and stars as a common. The Outer Space Treaty states that the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be the province of all humankind. The use of space shall be open and shared by all of humanity. The Outer Space Treaty was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1966, entered into force in 1967, and today has 117 state parties. The Moon Agreement designates the moon and celestial bodies as the common heritage of humankind. It was adopted in 1979, entered into force in 1984, and has only 17 state parties. One reason for its lower acceptance was the fear that it would hinder the expansion of commercial activities into outer space. The interpretation of these notions, province of humankind and common heritage, is affected by outer space drawing ever more attention as a source of value production. So let me turn to some recent developments in this regard. They shall also serve to illustrate the importance of property rights as a challenge to the conception of outer space as a common. For several years now, outer space is being explored as and progressively developed into a source of value. Activities in outer space promise economic surplus value in the form of money, surplus value in the form of power for states, and surplus value in the form of reputation for science and research. Exploration of outer space goes hand in hand with commercialization. Already in the 1980s, satellites are being operated by private companies. Today, they are used for telecommunication, navigation, Earth observation, and remote sensing. Mega constellations in the lower Earth orbit, LEO, are a more recent development. Starlink wants to place 40,000 satellites in LEO. Commercialization involves the private takeover of further infrastructures as well. SpaceX has become an important provider of transport services into space with its reusable rockets. Corporations also plan to operate space stations and expand space tourism. They are expected to play a major role in the establishment of a permanent human settlement on the moon as part of NASA's Artemis program. Raw materials such as water, helium-3, minerals, and metals shall be extracted in outer space. Water on the moon shall be processed into rocket fuel, lunar regolith used to build moon villages, metals processed in outer space to build and repair space stations, or transported back to Earth. Government actors currently determine and shape the development of this new space economy. They license activities in outer space, provide companies with infrastructures and knowledge, support them financially, and act as anchor customers. 2 examples. In 2020, SpaceX took American astronauts to the International Space Station for the first time. NASA had decommissioned its space shuttle in 2011 in order to no longer depend on the Russian-operated Soyuz spacecraft, which charged $90 million for each transport of a US astronaut to the ISS. NASA concluded contracts with SpaceX and other companies for the development of spacecraft. SpaceX could use NASA's launch pads and rocket hangars. Unlike previous cooperation partners, it was not obliged to share knowledge with NASA, but could acquire IP rights for this knowledge. The second example concerns the ISS, which is operated jointly by several countries. It is scheduled to cease operations by the end of this decade. The US company Axiom Space is currently developing a space station to take its place. The modules of the new private space station shall be used as research labs, as commercial production facilities inter alia for artificial retinas, organs, and pharmaceuticals, and as hotels. The crew cabins are being designed by the designer Philipp Stark. Together with Prada, Axiom Space is developing new spacesuits for NASA's moon mission. On September 12, 2025, the Bavarian government and Axiom signed a letter of commitment. Thus, Bavaria seeks to secure places on the private space station inter alia for its researchers. Commercialization is changing the role of the state. Spaceflight has long been dominated by state actors. Today, states are turning from owners of space infrastructure to customers, from control and supervisory authorities to partners in public-private partnerships. The partnerships are expected to have several benefits: new investment opportunities and stimulation of stagnant economic growth. Technological innovation shall benefit consumers and industry, for example, by improving internet connectivity and enabling automatic navigation of cars, ships, and aircraft, and it shall strengthen military and defense capabilities. Exploration and conquest of outer space shall renew faith in progress and national prestige. The public-private partnerships create new dependencies and restrict societal autonomy. Virtually all outer space services and infrastructures are dual use. That is, they can be and are being employed for military purposes. Contemporary warfare and drone strikes heavily depend on satellites. Therefore, governments are keen to retain control over the space industry. University research is increasingly being integrated into the commercial military use of space. The Ludwig Bölkow campus at the Technical University of Munich is one example for this development, as recently pointed out in a report by the group Academics for Justice. It is part of the Bavaria One initiative, which aims to turn Bavaria into Germany's Space Valley. It is located on the site of the former Luftfahrtforschungsanstalt Munich, Munich's Aviation Research Institute. This facility was built towards the end of World War II with forced labor from the Dachau concentration camp and was intended for the development and testing of military technology. Today, the new campus is home to research facilities and companies such as Hensoldt, which develops dual-use sensors for Earth observation. An amendment to the Bavarian University Act of 2024 prohibits civil clauses and thus seeks to ensure that such clauses do not hinder cooperation between research, the military, and outer space industry. Outer space once again has become the subject of a race. Unlike in the 1950s and 60s, it's not only states that are participating, but also corporations. Corporations compete for contracts and scarce resources, such as orbital positions. Governments compete for access to the new private space infrastructures. Some want to be attractive flag states, and to this end are reducing licensing requirements for non-governmental space activities. The development of space with the aim of surplus value can be described as a process of appropriation and privatized exploitation of the common. The expansion of property rights is an important part of this development. Property rights are of fundamental importance for privatized value creation. Property rights form the basis of economic activity and secure the value of assets. They are an important factor in creating expectations with respect to the future returns on investments. The value of an asset is determined by the revenue it is expected to generate in the future, the cash flows. Property rights give rise to and stabilize these expectations. They allow, for example, asteroid mining companies to trust that they can process and market the extracted resources and do not have to fear that third parties effectively question their entitlement to do so. So far, there are only rudimentary international regulations on property rights in outer space. The International Telecommunication Union grants temporary permissions for satellites to use positions on the geostationary orbit. These can be understood as property rights in space. And the Intergovernmental Agreement for the ISS stipulates that inventions can be patented and receive IP rights under the law of the state that operates the module in which the invention was made. These regulations are not sufficient, however, for the envisaged commercialization of outer space. The Economic Report of the United States President of 2021 therefore devotes an entire chapter to property rights in the space economy. It states that it is the fundamental task of government to create the legal and economic basis for investments in the new space economy through property rights. In 2015, the US had already taken a step toward expanding property rights. The Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act recognizes the property rights of US citizens that engage in space mining in the extracted raw materials. Luxembourg, the United Arab Emirates, and Japan followed suit with similar legislation. These laws have sparked an intense debate on whether property rights in space resources and the establishment of territorial rights on celestial bodies are compatible with the international law of outer space. I now turn to this international law of outer space. Before, I indicated that international law denotes outer space as a common of humanity. In this part of my talk, I want to trace the development of international outer space law and how, despite its explicit prohibition of appropriation, it may eventually support appropriation. The history of international space law reveals two things. One, space law emerged as a law governing the use of resources. Two, the extension of international law into outer space can itself be understood as a form of appropriation. Let me explain. International lawyers only began engaging with outer space when technological developments made human activities in space possible. That is, when the military, scientific, and economic usability of space resources became a concrete possibility. And here I understand resource use broadly to include the extraction of rock samples for research, the positioning of satellites and space stations, and the passage of rockets through outer space. A breakthrough for the use of outer space was the development of the A4 rockets, known as V2, during National Socialism by German rocket builders led by Wernher von Braun, who, after the war, seamlessly continued their work in the United States for NASA. With humanity's physical advance into space, space became, and I here refer to international lawyer Matthew Craven, a socialized space, beyond purely speculative and imaginative endeavors. Lawyers began to ask, what law applies in space? Is outer space a legal vacuum? Is it a normative free zone? Does the sovereignty of states extend beyond the airspace into the universe? Or is the airspace followed by a zone in which international law applies? And if so, what does international law say about this space? Is outer space, including its celestial bodies, a res nullius that states may appropriate through effective occupation, as they did with territories on the American, African, and Australian continents? Or is colonial appropriation prohibited? Consensus was quickly reached on the following points. First, no extension of sovereign rights beyond the airspace above the territory. To this day, however, disagreement persists about where airspace and thus sovereign power ends and where outer space begins. Second, international law applies in outer space. Third, the rules of international law on effective occupation do not apply, meaning that states do not have the right to appropriate parts of outer space and celestial bodies through occupation. Space thus became an internationalized space to be filled with international law. This task fell mainly to the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, established in 1959. Fundamental principles were adopted in 1963 with a General Assembly resolution, and in 1967 then the just mentioned Outer Space Treaty was adopted, and until today it is considered the Constitution of Outer Space. Article 2 prohibits the national appropriation of outer space, including celestial bodies, and I quote, by claim of sovereignty, by means or use of occupation, or by any other means. Furthermore, the treaty positively establishes the freedom of exploration and use, which shall be the province of all humankind. In retrospect, we may easily, and here I quote Matthew Craven again, overlook the undoubtedly radical character of this extraversion of international law into outer space. International law was suddenly declared to be of unlimited extent, intergalactic as much as international, an omnipresent order disarticulated from the site of its geographical origin, quote end. It is this extension of jurisdiction, I want to argue, that can be understood already as a form of appropriation, in the sense that the international community of states claimed the right to extend Earth's law into outer space in order to regulate and provide a legal infrastructure for its use. Some lawyers and government representatives wanted to limit the extraterrestrial expansion of international law and the claiming of outer space as the province of humankind. They wanted to do so given the potential existence of alien beings. In 1958, a representative of the Italian government thus remarked that space belonged to all states, but was also the property of all other communities of rational and organized beings on other planets. In 1970, Austrian space lawyer Ernst Fasan published a short monograph with the title Relations with Alien Intelligences. With a foreword by Wernher von Braun, the text outlines a meta-law to regulate extraterrestrial encounters between alien intelligent races and spacefaring humanity. Back to international space law. The Outer Space Treaty clearly formulates a prohibition of appropriation. It thus can be interpreted to preclude the application of the concepts of territory, of sovereignty, and of private property to outer space. The implication for the positive status of outer space and celestial body of the non-appropriation principle remained a bit unclear, however. Were they to be classified as res communis by analogy to the law of the high seas, as common property, or as a res ex commercium, or perhaps as res nullius combined with the prohibition of appropriation as provided for in a treaty for Spitzbergen that never entered into force? And what did the designation of use and exploration as the province of mankind mean concretely? There was consensus that economic use should be permitted, but should the commercial and privatized exploitation of space resources for surplus value also be permitted? These questions were addressed by two utopians among the space lawyers. Let me introduce them to you. One is the Argentinian Aldo Armando Coca, whom you see on the slide. Coca introduced the concept of common heritage of humankind into discussions on space law as early as 1954 at the 5th International Astronautical Congress in Innsbruck. The other, Günther Küchenhoff, is far less well known. In 1944, he published an essay on the concept of greater spaces in international law, a prime example of racist international law under National Socialism. After his denazification, he became a full professor at the University of Würzburg in 1955, where he turned his attention to the new field of international space law. Both saw space law as an opportunity for a new legal beginning. For Coca, the Outer Space Treaty, for the first time in history, constitutes humanity as a legal subject. It does so, according to Coca, by qualifying the use of space as the province of humankind and astronauts as envoys of humanity. Space law, he argued, was a jus humanitatis, a law of humanity that transcended the old international law that governed relations between states. Küchenhoff imagined outer space as a greater space of love in which his natural law ideas of a law of love should take effect. For both, outer space is a common. It is a common because the use and exploration of outer space have only become possible through the manifold interactions and contributions by human beings from around the world. According to Küchenhoff, the use of outer space is the result of the knowledge and skills that humanity as a whole has acquired throughout its history. The status of space as a common, in their understanding, thus, does not primarily result from physical characteristics and the supposed impossibility of appropriating and dividing outer space. This is, however, how Hugo Grotius had justified the status of the high seas as a res communis, as a common. Nor was the normative justification central to their argument that after the long period of colonization, all states and peoples should share in the use of the resources of outer space. Rather, the status and value of outer space as a common to Coca and Küchenhoff resulted from the contributions of humanity to its usability. As a consequence, neither individual states, no groups, no corporations should be allowed to extract and appropriate its value. Thus, Küchenhoff writes that anyone who develops a cosmic economic resource should only be allowed to retain the expenses incurred or demand compensation for their labor, but not appropriate any surplus value. The Outer Space Treaty could accommodate such an interpretation, yet it also does not explicitly prohibit privatized exploitation and value extraction. It contains no provisions on natural resources. Furthermore, there is no institutional operationalization of the governance of outer space as a common that Coca and Küchenhoff proposed. Without an international administration, the only option was a trusteeship construct, as envisaged by Küchenhoff. According to him, states should act as trustees of outer space. For Cocker, who was a critic of a state-centered order, this could not be satisfactory. Colonialism had proven that states repeatedly abused the role of trustee. Shortly after the first manned moon landing in 1969, Cocker therefore proposed a further international treaty on outer space. It was to codify the concept of common heritage of mankind and to regulate the use of natural resources of the moon and other celestial bodies. Negotiations on a moon treaty began in 1972 and lasted until 1979. They were closely linked personally and thematically to the negotiations on a legal regime for the deep seabed beyond national jurisdiction. Disagreements mainly concerned the concept of the common heritage. The US had accepted the term common heritage for the deep seabed in 1970 and was prepared to do so for celestial bodies and their natural resources as well. However, it did not accord the term any independent legal content. Instead, it regarded common heritage as a merely philosophical concept. Lawyers from the Soviet Union at first vehemently rejected common heritage. On the one hand, because of its vagueness, on the other hand, because of its association with appropriation and ownership. To representatives of the newly independent states, common heritage denoted common property of which they approved. This common property was to be managed by an international regime that ensured their participation and the equitable distribution of benefits from exploitation. The question of an international administration prompted further debate. The US wanted to distinguish between the collection of samples for scientific purposes, the use of raw materials by missions in outer space for their own needs, and finally, extraction for commercial purposes. They considered an international regime to be appropriate only for the latter. They also repeatedly opposed calls for a moratorium on the exploitation of raw materials that would prohibit commercial exploitation until the establishment of an international regime. Finally, a compromise was reached on the basis of a draft treaty proposed by the Austrian delegation, and after almost a decade of negotiations, the Moon Treaty was adopted by the General Assembly without a dissenting vote. It declares the Moon, other celestial bodies, and their natural resources to be the common heritage of mankind. It makes clear that neither the surface, nor the subsurface, nor the natural resources in place can become the property of any state. In addition, the parties undertake to establish an international regime for the management of resource exploitation at the time when such exploitation becomes feasible. This regime shall ensure the orderly development of space resources and the equitable distribution of benefits. Yet, the United States Senate refused to ratify the Moon Treaty. Reasons were the rise of market liberalism and effective lobbying, in particular by the L5 Society that supported the space colonization plans of physics professor Gerard O'Neill from Princeton. As a consequence, other states also refrained from acceding to the treaty, which is why today the Moon Treaty only has 17 parties. Today, the US government actively attempts to limit the effects of the Moon Treaty. An executive order dated April 6, 2020 states that the United States does not consider outer space to be a global commons, that the Moon Treaty is neither effective nor necessary, and that the US rejects attempts to treat its content as customary international law. And here I wish to insert a comparison with the law of the sea and the legal regime for the deep seabed. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea was negotiated at the same time as the Moon Treaty. Contrary to the Moon Treaty, this convention did establish an international organization for the management of the deep seabed and its minerals as common heritage of mankind. Yet here too, market orientation has prevailed. The designation of the seabed as common heritage could not prevent the division of the deep seabed into license areas to be mined by individual and private entities in competition and for the private gain of individual states and corporations. Today, the meaning of common heritage in international law appears largely reduced to a question of the distribution of benefits from privatized exploitation. In today's debates on outer space, however, not even the question of distribution is central anymore. The prohibition of appropriation in the Outer Space Treaty appears today as the last frontier to be overcome for private appropriation and commercialization of outer space. However, attempts to overcome this prohibition are still met with criticism. Thus, a number of space lawyers and state representatives in the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space have criticized the national laws that I mentioned before that recognize private ownership in extracted resources. They regard this recognition as a clear violation of the prohibition of appropriation. They argue that only the international community of states can allow the acquisition of private property, but not individual states through unilateral legal acts. Moreover, they hold that if states were to grant companies territorial rights, that is, rights to exclusively use certain areas on celestial bodies, for example, for mining activities, this would constitute an exercise of territorial jurisdiction, and that such territorial jurisdiction would also violate the prohibition of appropriation in the Outer Space Treaty. I want to focus, however, here on the opposite view and now walk you through the legal moves to turn the prohibition of appropriation into a right to appropriate. States that advocate for the privatized exploitation of raw materials and for territorial rights in outer space do not openly reject the Outer Space Treaty because they recognize that a space economy depends on international cooperation. Instead, they attempt to influence the interpretation of space law through practice and legal reasoning. They are working towards removing the last utopian surplus of the constitution of outer space that still separates it from the reality of privatized exploitation and colonization. The admissibility of appropriating space resources is justified as follows. Firstly, it is argued that neither the Outer Space Treaty nor the Moon Treaty contain an explicit prohibition on the extraction of raw materials and the appropriation of extracted raw materials. Even the Moon Treaty explicitly prohibits only the appropriation of resources in situ, in place, but is silent on appropriation after extraction. Secondly, it is argued that both extraction and acquisition of ownership are covered by the freedom of use of outer space that the Outer Space Treaty recognizes. Finally, it is argued that even though the Moon Treaty provides for the establishment of an international regime to administer the exploitation of raw materials, it does not establish a moratorium on space mining until such a regime is put in place. Proponents of the acquisition of property in space resources seek to reinforce this interpretation by, you would have guessed it, referring to John Locke. They stress that resource extraction depends on labor and capital investments, that the wealth of resources in outer space is so vast that even with commercial exploitation, enough would be left to satisfy the needs of others and of future generations, and that the general public would benefit from private extraction due to the economic value created and the supply of the market with raw materials. The national laws that already recognize property rights in space resources can strengthen this interpretation. They count as subsequent practice within the meaning of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties that shall inform treaty interpretation. A further instance of such relevant subsequent practice are the contracts that NASA has concluded with 4 selected companies on the transfer of ownership of space resources collected by these companies to NASA. The Artemis Accords shall also support the appropriation-friendly interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. These are a non-binding instrument drafted by the United States, which has several advantages over trying to negotiate a binding treaty. It was first signed on October 13, 2020 by the United States and 7 partner spacefaring nations. Today, the accords count 56 signatory states. Germany is among them. Apparently, Germany was promised a place of a German astronaut in the Artemis mission as payment for signature. The Artemis Accords are relevant to the interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty as a subsequent agreement within the meaning of the just mentioned Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. They affirm the importance of compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. They further formulate the aim to establish principles for cooperation in the civil exploration and use of the Moon, Mars, comets, and asteroids, and to operatively implement the obligations of the Outer Space Treaty. Section 10 of the Artemis Accords explicitly states that, and I quote, "Extraction of resources does not inherently constitute national appropriation under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty." Another objective of the Artemis Accords concerns the establishment of territorial rights. Territorial rights are important not only for the exploitation of raw materials, they are also needed for other territorial activities whose profitability depends on the ability to exclude others from entering and using a specific area. Territorial or land rights become all the more important as competition for land use increases. Such competition is anticipated for the lunar South Pole. It is of particular interest because of its geological and geographical characteristics. They facilitate the extraction of ice water and solar energy and further exploration activities, especially towards Mars. Due to the moon craters, suitable sites for landing and launch pads, for the planned installation of nuclear reactors, for water and fuel extraction, and for moon villages are therefore limited. In view of the anticipated competition for land use on the moon, the Artemis Accords introduced the concept of safety zones. Safety zones shall protect activities on the moon from interference and, among other things, be used in a manner that promotes the, I quote, "safe and efficient extraction and utilization of space resources," quote end. This legal innovation is also presented as an operational implementation of the rules of the Outer Space Treaty. Safety zones, it is said, would prompt consultation and due diligence obligations and thus serve to specify the rules on liability and non-interference of the Outer Space Treaty. However, the establishment of safety zones can also be interpreted not as a legal cooperation device, but as a legal technique for securing landed property on the moon. The US President's economic report describes them as such and compares them to barbed wire for demarcating and securing land ownership. Thus understood, safety zones pave the way for states to claim territorial jurisdiction and to establish land ownership on the moon. Finally, the Artemis Accords introduce a distinction between public and private that is foreign to the Outer Space Treaty but characteristic of liberal economic law. The Outer Space Treaty does not distinguish between public and private activities, but only between governmental and non-governmental activities, but it declares both or classifies both as national activities. It could be inferred that all space activities, whether by governmental or non-governmental actors, must serve the interest of humanity and that not only states but also non-governmental space actors are bound directly by international law to ensure as much. The Artemis Accords now explicitly mention a private sector. They state that private sector activities are to be exempt from the obligation to share scientific data. This new distinction between private and public activities may serve to exempt private commercial activities from social obligations, for example, to allow access or to share data. The obligation to ensure that activities for private benefit also serve the public interest then exclusively falls on the public sector, just as under national law it is the government that is to ensure the social function of property. However, there is no institutionalized public sector for outer space. This task would therefore have to be performed by individual states or the governments represented in the UN committee. Given the competition between states in the race for space and the public-private partnerships in the commercial and military development of outer space, it's unlikely that governments will perform this task effectively. What would this mean for the designation of outer space as a common? It would mean that it loses any legal significance, that also land in space can be appropriated, divided, and used for surplus value production, that the notion of the common or province of mankind merely serves as an argument to call for international regulation to safeguard public interests, for example, in the reduction of space waste. Increasingly, states, corporations, and individuals even go a step further and embrace colonization as liberation from even this minimalist understanding of what it means to use space in the interest of all humanity. From justifying private appropriation and territorial jurisdiction, it is a small step to justifying the colonization of space. Today, the colonization of space is no longer the stuff of science fiction. Space lawyers who work closely with governments act as apologists for a colonial space law. One space lawyer, for example, speculates on how settlements on the Moon and Mars might become independent states. The formation of states may be necessary in the future, he argues, in order to create a government that can authoritatively settle conflicts between different actors, for example, over territorial claims on Mars. Such state formation should not, he continues, be considered a violation of the principle of non-appropriation. This principle only applies to activities in space that originate on Earth. If Mars settlements declared their independence from Earth, Earth's space law would lose its validity. He concludes that the colonization of space did not pose the same problems as colonial land grabs on Earth, as space was not inhabited by indigenous populations. Space colonization projects are not of the techno-utopian and astro-futurist type popular in the 1960s and 70s. They are part of openly racist and fascist political agendas characteristic of what Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor call end times fascism. In the United States President's inaugural address in January 2025, the conquest of Moon and Mars not only represented America's new greatness, it was also presented as a continuation of the success story of the colonization of the American continent by white settlers. To prominent players in the new space economy, such as Elon Musk, space colonies promise liberation from social, ecological, and political ties, from obligations to the community, and from human and non-human cohabitants on Earth. The technology that enables interplanetary freedom shall also serve the space pioneers free the space pioneers from the limitations of their fragile and finite bodies. As explained by Matthew Craven, space law in the 1960s was intended to suppress two scenarios. One was colonization, the other was the militarization of space with the potential to destroy the whole planet. Yet space law, as also stressed by Craven, was never post-colonial, just as it never ruled out militarization entirely. Plans to make states trustees were expressions of colonial continuities, and racist overtones have characterized writings on space law all along. In his book Relations with Alien Intelligences, Ernst Fasan attributes to intelligent races the will to expand their habitat. Therefore, they became spacefarers, while only, I quote, certain degenerate races remained stationary. In view of processes of appropriation and colonization that the law could not suppress, but that it sustains, lawyers may ask themselves, what could be the task of law and legal scholarship? Some lawyers insist that the appropriation and colonization of space violates international law and call out such violations. Some advocate for the regulation of the new space economy in multilateral fora and guided by sustainability goals. Some seek interdisciplinary collaborations to explore market designs that create incentives, for example, for the avoidance and reduction of space debris. I do not believe any of this to be sufficient to contain the ecological damage, increases in power, comprehensive surveillance, and potential for military destruction that accompany the commercial military development of outer space. I would therefore like to return to the concept of the common and its legal and institutional implementation. Today's understanding of the common in space law is reductionist. It does not resist but accommodate appropriation, division, and transformation of space and its resources into assets. The use of space and its privatized exploitation is considered to be the province of all mankind already when it creates new consumption opportunities, when it is taxed, and when government regulation prevents excessive damage to the environment and cultural heritage. Thus understood, the term province of all mankind and common heritage lose any independent legal significance. I now want to turn to an indigenous intervention against space colonization to introduce yet another understanding of outer space as a common. To recap, so far I mentioned 1, an understanding that considers outer space a common for its physical characteristics. 2, an understanding that considers it a common due to the contribution of humanity to its usability. 3, a normative claim that outer space should be a common and benefits from its exploitation should be distributed equitably in light of hundreds of years of colonial exploitation. 4, the reductionist version that collapses the common into a claim that governments should ensure that private exploitation also serves the public. I now turn to a 5th understanding. In an essay co-written by university researchers and members of the Yolngu people of Australia, the authors explain the Yolngu's relationship to space, which they call sky country. Country, they write, includes lands, seas, waters, rocks, animals, winds, and all the beings that exist in and make up a place, including people. It also embraces the stars, moon, Milky Way, solar winds and storms, and intergalactic plasma. The exposition of the Yolngu people's lawful relations, including their ethical obligations to attend to and care for sky country as a dwelling place of their ancestors, is motivated by a concern that plans for the exploitation and colonization of space may harm their relations with and beyond the sky. The text is an intervention as expressed by its subtitle of Talking Back to Colonization, and to refute claims that outer space is not inhabited and colonization therefore for will not harm indigenous populations. Just as technologically enabled use has created outer space as a socialized space, structured by international law, so too do the practices of the Yolnu and their social ecological relations with Sky Country create a socialized space. Their practices and relationships are constitutive not only for the community and the identity of its members, but also for outer space as their common. And here I want to introduce a distinction between the common and the commons with S. The definition of philosopher François Julien of the common captures what the text describes about the Yolnu relations to Sky Country. According to Julien, the commons is what we are part of or in which we take part, which is shared out and in which we participate. The common causes us to belong and takes root in practice and experience. The common, thus understood, emerges from practice. Contrary to the universal, it denotes the particularities of individuals and communities and focuses on relations and experiences. The Yolnu have socialized the moon through their rituals and practices. In a similar vein, we could say that our songs and poems create a web of relations that make moon and sky part of a common. What is particular about indigenous interventions against the commercialization of outer space, but also against the mining of the seabed, is that they insist that their relations to the ocean and sky as part of country are legal and not just cultural relations. And I would like to suggest to use the term commons with an S for systems of social ecological relations such as those of the Yolnu, in which individuals, communities, and common goods mutually constitute each other, as well as their legal and institutional arrangements. So it's the concrete legal and institutional arrangement that makes a commons. If international lawyers recognized that outer space was already socialized, they might consider to turn to something like Fazan's meta-law that he had devised for encounters with alien intelligences. They could apply diplomatic protocols to the encounters between indigenous and state jurisdictions. Apart from recognizing that the sky is socialized not only through technology-enabled use of space resources, and apart from devising protocols for lawful encounters, lawyers may also contribute to the task of socialization and commons formation in order to reclaim land and sky from appropriation, division, and surplus value production. And here I would like to make a connection between projects of socialization, between international projects of socialization and local ones like Deutsche Wohnen und Co. Enteignen in Berlin. So first I turn to the international law projects. Like Cocker, many of his contemporaries, after centuries of colonial exploitation, fascism, and world wars, worked towards establishing an international law that would guarantee peace, self-determination, and justice. And among them was also Algerian lawyer and future ICJ judge Mohamed Bejawi and the ecologist and law of the sea expert Elisabeth Mann-Borghese. Their writings indicate how they envisioned an international law of humanity, solidarity, and planetary habitability for outer space and the oceans. They all held the view that this law must overcome concepts of sovereignty, territoriality, and private property. Mann-Borghese begins her outline for a global ocean regime from 1969 with a warning against extending the law of the land to the ocean. This would, according to Mann-Borghese, first lead to the death of the ocean and then to the death of the planet. For all three, the concept of common heritage of mankind, understood as common property, was central to preventing appropriation, division, and exploitation. Mann-Borghese's institutional design for managing the ocean as common property was inspired by contemporary institutional experiments in participatory democracy. Applying these ideas to the ocean, she envisioned envisioned an institution with different chambers in which not only governments, but also fisheries, scientific associations, business associations, and others participate in governance. This form of government could be extended, in her view, beyond the ocean, with the goal not to create a world state, but, and I quote Borghese, a flexible system of cooperative world communities evolving new, though already recognizable, principles of democracy, of federalism, of planning, and of law. In this conception, international law, through the design of new organizational forms and designs, would play an active part in socialization and the creation of commons. We may now recognize the similarities to the project of socialization in Berlin. As you probably all know, the initiative Deutsche Wohnen und Co. enteignen seeks to activate Article 15 of the German Basic Law to transfer private property in housing real estate held by large corporations into common property for the purpose of socialization, and I would add the creation of commons. The aim is twofold. First, transfer into common property aims at liberation from domination and assetization. Second, it opens space for new institutions and legal arrangements to foster non-hierarchical social and ecological relationships. This process, which is intended to promote freedom in relation and to maintain habitability for all, can be called socialization. And to conclude, I have no illusions about being able to convince governments with these ideas. However, people around the world are campaigning against the exploitation and destruction of the common for decolonization, freedom, and habitability of the planet. Lawyers who take up the cause of socialization and the commons could and should work with these movements transnationally and transdisciplinarily to develop legal concepts, institutional arrangements, and new forms for the commons. And my plea would be not to forget about the moon in these struggles. Thank you. Sorry for